great hall of Silvermane Castle fell silent as the mourners gathered. Torchlight flickered against ancient stone walls, casting dancing shadows across the faces of those who had come to say farewell to their king. The air hung heavy with grief, thick as morning fog over the northern mountains. At the center of the hall, upon a carved platform of dark oak, lay King Aldrich the Brave. His hands were folded across his chest, still wearing the ceremonial armor he had donned for what everyone believed was his final battle. The red fabric of his tunic seemed to glow in the firelight, and his face held an expression of peace that none had seen upon it in many years of war and worry. The people of the kingdom had traveled from every corner of the realm to witness this moment. Farmers from the southern valleys stood beside merchants from the eastern ports. Knights in their finest armor lined the walls, their heads bowed in respect. Even the rival lords from the border territories had set aside their feuds to honor the fallen king. Among the assembled crowd, one figure stood apart from the rest. Her name was Lyanna, and she wore the simple green and cream dress of an Omega, the lowest rank in the rigid hierarchy of their world. Her dark hair was pulled back in a long braid that fell past her shoulders, and her eyes, bright and alert, never left the king's still form. The other Omegas whispered behind their hands as they watched her. It was unusual for one of their station to stand so close to the royal platform. It was even more unusual for an Omega to stare so intently at an Alpha King, even one who lay in state. But Lyanna had earned a special place in the castle through her years of service in the healing chambers, and no one had the heart to send her away on this day of mourning. High Priest Tormund stepped forward, his ceremonial robe sweeping across the polished floor. He was an elderly man with a long white beard and eyes that had seen the crowning of 3 generations of kings. His voice when he spoke carried the weight of ages and the sorrow of the present moment. "We gather here today to honor King Aldrich," he began, his words echoing through the vast chamber. "A ruler who defended our borders with courage, who dispensed justice with wisdom, and who carried the weight of the crown with dignity for 30 years. The crowd murmured their agreement, and several people wiped tears from their eyes. Lyanna's fingers tightened around the small leather satchel she carried at her side. The priest continued recounting the king's many achievements. He spoke of the Treaty of 3 Rivers, which had brought peace to the war-torn western provinces. He recalled the Great Famine, when Aldrich had opened the royal granaries to feed his people. He described battles won and alliances forged, each story painting the picture of a leader who had dedicated his life to his kingdom. As the eulogy went on, Lyanna felt her heart beating faster. She took a step closer to the platform, then another. Her eyes never left the king's chest, watching, waiting, searching for something that no one else seemed to notice. Princess Elena, the king's only daughter, stood at the head of the platform. She was a striking woman with her father's strong features and her mother's gentle eyes. Tears streamed down her face as she listened to the priest's words. Beside her stood the royal physicians, their expressions grave and weary from the long vigil they had kept at the king's bedside. 3 days ago, the priest said, his voice growing softer, our beloved king fell in the throne room. The physicians tell us his great heart finally surrendered to the burden it had carried for so long. Now we prepare to lay him to rest in the royal crypt alongside his ancestors, where he may find the peace that eluded him in life. It was at this moment that Lyanna could contain herself no longer. She stepped forward from the crowd, her movement causing heads to turn and whispers to ripple through the assembly like wind across wheat fields. "Stop," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the hushed hall. The priest paused mid-sentence, his eyebrows rising in surprise. Princess Elena looked up, confusion crossing her tear-stained face. The royal guards tensed, hands moving to their sword hilts, uncertain whether this interruption posed a threat. "I beg your pardon?" the priest said, his tone more puzzled than angry. Lyanna took another step forward, her legs trembling but her voice steady. "You cannot bury him. He is not dead." A gasp swept through the crowd. Several people began to speak at once, their voices rising in shock and indignation. How dare an Omega interrupt the sacred funeral rites? Had grief driven the poor girl mad? Who was she to contradict the learned physicians who had examined the king? Princess Elena raised her hand, calling for silence. When the hall had quieted once more, she addressed Lyanna directly. "Child, I understand your sorrow. We all love my father, but the physicians have confirmed what we all feared. His heart has stopped. He draws no breath. He has been lying here for 2 days without movement or sign of life. With respect, Your Highness, Lyanna said, bowing her head briefly before meeting the princess's eyes once more. I have been watching him since I entered this hall an hour ago, and I have seen what others have missed. And what is that? Asked one of the royal physicians, an older man named Castor, who had served the royal family for decades. His voice carried a note of condescension that made Lyanna's cheeks flush, but she did not back down. His chest rises and falls, she said simply, not with the rhythm of normal breathing, but it moves. And there is color beneath his skin that should not be there if death had truly claimed him 2 days ago. The physician shook his head. Impossible. We have examined him thoroughly. There is no heartbeat, no breath, no response to any stimulus. These are simply tricks of the torchlight, and your own grief playing with your perception. But Princess Elena had moved closer to her father's body. She leaned over him, her own breathing shallow as she studied his face with new attention. After a long moment, she placed her hand gently over his heart. There is something, she whispered. It is so faint I can barely feel it, but... She looked up at the physician, her eyes wide. Castor, come here. Feel this. The old physician approached, reluctance evident in every step. He placed his experienced hand where the princess indicated and stood still as stone, concentrating. His expression shifted from skepticism to confusion to something approaching wonder. By the ancient laws, he breathed, there is a pulse. Impossibly weak, impossibly slow, but it is there. The hall erupted into chaos once more. People pressed forward, trying to see for themselves. The guards struggled to maintain order. Questions flew through the air like arrows. How could this be? Why hadn't the physicians detected it before? What did it mean? Lyanna pushed through the crowd until she stood beside the platform. She opened her leather satchel and withdrew several small glass vials and bundles of dried herbs. I have seen this condition only once before, she said, her voice rising to be heard above the commotion. In the healing text from the ancient library, it is called the deep sleep of the wolf. She looked around at the assembled faces, knowing she had to make them understand quickly. In alpha bloodlines, especially those of great power, there exists a rare protective mechanism. When the body suffers a shock so severe that death seems certain, the spirit can retreat deep within, slowing all functions to preserve the spark of life. The heart beats only once for every 100 normal beats. The breath comes only once in several minutes. To all outward signs, the person appears dead. Why did we not detect this? Castor demanded, though his tone was more curious now than defensive. Because you were looking for signs of life as they normally appear, Lyanna explained. You listened for a regular heartbeat and heard nothing. You watched for the rise and fall of breathing and saw stillness. But if you watch for longer periods, if you feel for the faintest tremor of pulse, the signs are there. Princess Elena gripped Lyanna's arm. Can he be saved? Can we bring him back? Perhaps, Lyanna said carefully. The texts describe a treatment, though I have never performed it myself. We must work quickly. The longer the spirit remains withdrawn, the harder it becomes to call it back. She began to work with swift efficiency, her hands steady despite the weight of so many eyes upon her. She mixed powders and liquids, creating compounds from recipes she had memorized from ancient manuscripts. Some of the ingredients she rubbed into the king's temples and wrists, following the paths of energy flow that the old healing masters had mapped long ago. Others she prepared for him to swallow, if and when he regained the ability to do so. The crowd watched in breathless silence. Even those who doubted her methods found themselves hoping, praying that this Omega girl with her unconventional knowledge might succeed where trained physicians had failed. Hours passed. Lyanna worked without rest, applying hot compresses, then cold, manipulating pressure points, speaking softly to the king, though he showed no sign of hearing. She taught the princess how to massage his hands and feet, maintaining circulation to his extremities. She instructed the physicians on which herbs to burn, filling the air with aromatic smoke that was said to draw the wandering spirit back to its body. As dawn light began to filter through the high windows, painting the stone walls in shades of pink and gold, a change came over the king. His finger twitched. It was the smallest movement imaginable, but in that hall full of watchers it seemed as significant as an earthquake. There, Lyanna said, exhaustion evident in her voice but triumph lighting her eyes. He is coming back. The king's eyelids fluttered. His chest rose in a deeper breath than any he had taken in days. Color began to return to his face, subtle at first, then more pronounced. His lips parted and a soft sound emerged. Not quite a word, but definitely a sign of consciousness. Princess Elena took her father's hand, tears flowing freely once more, though these were tears of joy. "Father, can you hear me?" King Aldrich's eyes opened slowly, blinking against the torchlight. His gaze moved around the hall, taking in the assembled mourners, the decorations of grief, the ceremonial platform upon which he lay. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse but laced with dry humor. "I seem to have missed my own funeral," he said. "What a pity. I've always wondered what people would say about me when I was gone." A wave of relieved laughter swept through the hall, breaking the tension that had held everyone in its grip for so many hours. People embraced each other, strangers and friends alike sharing in the joy of this impossible resurrection. The king's eyes found Lyanna, standing modestly to the side now that her work was done. "You," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You brought me back." Lyanna bowed her head. "I only did what the old texts taught, Your Majesty. The strength to return was yours alone." "Nevertheless," the king said, struggling to sit up with his daughter's help, "you saw what others missed. You believed when belief seemed foolish. You acted when others accepted the inevitable." He looked around the hall, his commanding presence already reasserting itself despite his weakness. "Let it be known throughout the kingdom that this woman, Lyanna of the Healing Chambers, has saved the life of her king." In the days that followed, as King Aldrich recovered his strength and resumed his duties, the story of his miraculous return spread far and wide. Bards composed songs about the Omega who had stopped a royal funeral. Artists painted scenes of that dramatic moment when Lyanna had stepped forward to challenge the gathered mourners and physicians. But for Lyanna herself, the greatest reward came quietly. In a private audience with the king a week after his awakening, he had called her to his study, a comfortable room lined with books and warmed by a cheerful fire. "I have been thinking," he said as she stood before his desk, "about the hierarchy of our society. We place such importance on the circumstances of birth, on whether one is born alpha, beta, or omega. We assume these labels define a person's worth, their capabilities, their place in the world." He rose and walked to the window, looking out over his kingdom. "But you have shown me something important, Lyanna. You have shown me that wisdom and courage are not the sole property of alphas, that sometimes the quiet voice is the one speaking truth, that those we consider least may see most clearly." He turned back to face her. "I am promoting you to Chief Royal Healer, a position newly created. You will oversee all the healing work in the castle and train others in both the old ways and the new, and perhaps in time, your example will help us all remember that every person, regardless of their station, has gifts to offer." Lyanna felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I am honored, Your Majesty. I will serve to the best of my ability." "I know you will," the king said with a smile. "After all, you already have." As Lyanna left the royal study and walked through the castle corridors, she passed many people who now greeted her with respect and admiration. But she remained the same person she had always been, carrying her leather satchel of healing supplies, watching carefully for signs that others might miss, and remembering the lesson that this extraordinary experience had taught her. Sometimes the most important thing is simply to pay attention, to trust what you observe, and to have the courage to speak up when everyone else believes the story is already over. Because sometimes, with patience and care and knowledge passed down through generations, you can help write a new ending. Sometimes you can bring someone back from the very edge of eternity and give them another chance at life. And that, Lyanna thought as she smiled to herself, was the greatest magic of all.